Welcome to this afternoon's session, NAESP webinar session on Principal Performance Appraisal. We are very pleased and honored to have a wonderful session for you this afternoon on Principal Performance Appraisal in Canada. And with us we have Dr. Joanne Robinson, who is the Director of Professional Learning for the Ontario Principals Council, the OPC. They've been doing some outstanding work on developing leadership capacity through an appraisal process that requires a collaboration between school leaders and supervisors. And many of our members, of course, are very interested in this topic of principal evaluation. This will be one of a series that we offer. And we just felt that we really needed to offer a session on this from Ontario because they're doing so many innovative things. Joanne, Dr. Robinson has an extensive background in professional development and has served as president of the Ontario Principals Council. She has many years of experience working with principals and vice principals in developing workshops and courses and online learning programs. And she's passionate about mentoring and coaching principals to support educational, improvement. And with that, Joanne, I'd like to welcome you, and we look forward to your good guidance.
Thank you, Honor. It's a pleasure to be here. And the opportunity for OPC in Ontario to work with NAESP is a real treat, so thank you very much. I'd like to explain that the presentation today, I've kind of divided it up into three different sections. Just at the beginning, to give you a little bit of background about the kind of the Canadian context, or certainly the Ontario context. And the whole second section, I'm going to give you quite a bit of information about Ontario's leadership framework. And the reason for an emphasis on that is our performance appraisal process is very much based on what we call exemplar of effective school leadership. And finally, I'll finish up with how the actual process of performance appraisal works in Ontario. So that's the overview of where we're going to start. And to start with, one of the things that I think is interesting and probably different from most of the principals in the USA is the whole notion that principals themselves are considered management. A few years ago, in 1998, it was decided that principals and vice principals could no longer be part of a union, and with all of the support that goes with that. So in turn, they formed a professional association. And as Anna mentioned, I had the opportunity to serve as the first president of that organization. And it was at that time we decided that working with principals and vice principals across the province would be a focus. And performance appraisal was part of the whole professional development emphasis that we focused upon. Just an understanding that in Ontario, the whole appraisal process is based on, we use the word trust or collaboration, and certainly professionalism. And all of us in education like that word because it seems to give off an important understanding of the fact that every person in the system is a lifelong learner and focusing on continuous improvement. And that's a foundational philosophy, I would say, of our system here. The other thing that is important to understand about the background of the PPA process in Ontario is it's designed to help principals and vice principals, both new and experienced, to achieve their full potential as school leaders. So it's a process for principals that is meant to support and promote professional growth and development. And that, I think, is one of the key emphases that we try to ensure that our new and experienced principals understand. So what are the key components? Well, we have, I've got some lists here, but these are, I think, what I would describe as the steps that we follow in this growth-oriented process. Certainly, setting the goals and priorities is step one, and we always emphasize that it's an opportunity to align the school and local community context into the development goals. So we know that the principal of the school is the leader and is the one who's sharing that vision and setting direction. So setting goals and priorities that are aligned with the focus of the school or the vision of the school is important. Now, the performance plan stage is the what is called the developing the goals and priorities, but it's certainly in conjunction or in collaboration with the appraising person. So a vice principal is appraised with the principal of the school, in schools that have principal and vice principals. And if it's a principal situation, it is a supervisory officer. But it's a consultation process. It's a collaboration. We call it professional dialogue. Third one is the annual growth plan, and it is just as it's described, which is the goals and priorities or the emphasis that leaders are focusing on throughout the year. And the culminating part of that is that every 5 years, that's our cycle here, every 5 years that results in a performance plan or a performance process. Performance is basically the measurable outcomes of the work that the goals that have been set. So things like, has the principal been working diligently towards those goals, or have they overcome some of the challenges that the discussion has led to identify, or has the principal engaged teachers and others in the whole improvement planning process? So, and of course, the ultimate question is whether or not the goals have been achieved, and if they have, sort of next steps, and if they have not, then why not? What are the extenuating circumstances? The summative report is that 5-year summation of 5 years of work, and again, it is done more as a professional dialogue as opposed to a report card that we all know. And the rating of satisfactory or unsatisfactory is the culmination of that. To emphasize, it's a growth-based model. It's intended to develop and support principals, new and experienced, and sustain leadership of the highest possible quality. We have the ministry here, the Ministry of Education, has a forward leadership or a provincial school leadership strategy, and this is very much integral to that whole process. And again, one of the key conditions is that collaboration, a spirit of mutual trust, and it's a condition for the success of the appraisal process. And we always say it's important to catch people doing things well as opposed to doing them wrong. And certainly the principals and vice principals themselves play a critical role in focusing the decisions and actions on improving student achievement and well-being. And so the appraisal process is very much founded on the role of the school leader in influencing student achievement and well-being. This next section, I want to emphasize to you how the Ontario Leadership Framework really sets the targets or sets the instructional program and the appraisal process for all principals and vice principals. We have a fairly extensive program that is, we call it a framework, and it's divided into these 5 domains, and under each domain there are 21 practices that are explicitly described and highly associated with effective leadership. So the setting direction, building relationships, developing people, developing the organization, and to support desired practices, key, improving the instructional program, and securing accountability. Each of those is clearly described and sets the exemplar, I would describe it as, or it's the description of what effective leadership looks like. We also have a synthesis, I would call it, of what effective leadership looks like or what effective leaders do. And certainly within that is the whole notion of what we call the core leadership capacities. And those capacities are things like setting direction or using data or having those important conversations with people in the school, outside of the school, in the community, and so on. So all of those core capacities are where the professional growth and professional learning as a result, the professional appraisal is focused. We also have just recently, within the last 3 months actually, identified what we call personal leadership resources. What that means is some of the things that all good school leaders associate with effective leadership, things like problem solving, the cognitive skills that go with leadership, problem solving, knowledge of effective practices, emotional intelligence, and things that are a little less tangible and measurable, but the psychological resources like optimism or resilience and self-efficacy, the things that we know are highly associated with effective leadership. So this leadership framework gives us a very clear description of what it is we're working toward. And because it's a professional dialogue process, the professional dialogue focuses on these 5 domains and 21 practices, core leadership capacities.
We have a question. Could you tell us a little about how you developed these areas in this framework?
Yes, they are very interesting, and they are based very much on international research. We're very fortunate here in Ontario to have some world-renowned researchers like Dr. Ken Leafwood and Dr. Michael Fullen and Ben Levin and so on. So these core leadership practices, or the framework, were developed based on the research, and then they were vetted, I guess would be the word, through all of the key stakeholders, like the principals organizations themselves. I certainly had lots of opportunity to present what OPC is thinking about that, and practicing principals had an opportunity to give feedback, and certainly the supervisory officers associations were given opportunity to give feedback. So the simple answer to a very good question is based on research, and it's not just Canadian research or Ontario research, it's certainly international research, and then with feedback and suggestions from all the stakeholders throughout Ontario. And the leadership framework itself has just been revised from the 5 domains with before it was divided into the skills and competencies and the attitudes, and people found that a little nebulous, a little difficult to nail down. So now we've got them actually associated with the behaviors, the practices. And at the end of the slideshow, there is a website that you can get, and you can actually look at the framework itself.
And one other question, Joanne, as you know, in America, or U.S., we have so many of our states are focused on student achievement results. Do any of these areas kind of, are aligned to that sort of area?
Absolutely. Well, a lot of them are actually, but certainly the improving the instructional program and securing accountability are very closely aligned with student achievement, and we have a real focus here right now on safe schools and schools that are environmentally safe. I can't think of a better word, but sort of eco schools and the bullying prevention and things like that. So those 2 areas, the domain of improving the instructional program, is very much focused on the teaching and learning process and working with teachers and making sure that the data defines the goals and sets the priorities, and certainly securing accountability relates to the external accountability measures like standardized testing and things like that, and the internal, which are sort of the school growth plans and identified school improvement planning process. And we have something else called the school effectiveness framework, which is another exemplar that we use to define our growth and capacity building. The next slide is a good description. In fact, it's written across the top of our leadership framework, because one of the things that we like to emphasize, that the most effective leaders are the ones who are building capacity within their schools. Michael Fullen always says the measure of an effective leader is how many leaders are left behind when that person leaves the building. So this definition is embedded in our framework, the exercise of influence on organizational members and other stakeholders toward the identification and achievement of the organization's vision and goals. And that is very much a driver of the leadership framework. Kind of goes into how does the framework guide the principal performance appraisal process. So what it does is a standard that is known to all school leaders and administrators. So depending, it doesn't matter whether the role is vice principal or principal. It doesn't matter if the role is the supervisory officer or somebody who is in that capacity. The leadership framework is even posted on ministry websites and very accessible to the public to increase public accountability. So it's something that is the exemplar for all of us to work toward. And a key factor in understanding that is that everyone understands that no one is perfect in all domains of leadership. It's a known fact that we're working towards the exemplar. And that is a whole mindset, a whole attitude that gives license to school leaders to be creative, to take risks, to do what they know is right for their particular environment, for their school. So it's important to understand that the practices and behaviors that do demonstrate excellence in one school will be distinct and different from excellence in another. And in fact, when school leaders go from one school to another, it doesn't necessarily require the same skill set. It just requires the same leadership development capacity. And that's, especially for new principals, that's a little bit of a challenging concept to grasp, but they seem to get onto it as soon as they have more than one building experience. So it's meant to be, it's not meant to be a checklist, but it gives the exemplar, it gives the guideline, it gives the idea of what it is we're all working towards. The most important result of this framework has been the common language that we're all using across Ontario, and that has been very refreshing for all of us. The Ontario Leadership Framework provides a resource for school and system leaders to identify the practices for building expertise in a wide range of leadership capacities. And as a result, when we talk about identifying the areas of expertise, then that gives us a framework from which to design the growth plan, which is, of course, what our performance appraisal process is based on. On the next slide, you can see the core leadership capacities. Well, we have the 5 domains of setting direction and building relationships and developing the organization, the list that you saw previously. If anybody in Ontario were to say, what are the most important qualities of leadership that influence your school environment, influence your capacity building, influence your district environment, these would be the 5 that are always referred to. And when you think about what they are the foundation of what effective leadership looks like, and it doesn't matter if you're in the USA or Canada or South America or the Middle East. These are the things that make the difference. Being able to set goals, and of course not just set the goals, but encourage and build ownership of the goals among others. And you know, the hard one about engaging in courageous conversations. We all have people in our schools, in our systems that we're needing to have conversations with, and respectful conversations but lead to action, and promoting collaborative learning cultures. I mean, I'm sure just as in here we have lots of people who are working in professional learning teams or network learning and so on. And of course the foundation is the using data. And for those of us who are a little longer in the tooth, the whole notion of using data to build our school improvement plans, to set our goals, to define our progress, and to measure and to redefine our direction. That it's a new thing. It's a new skill set, but we know that it's fundamental. And again, part of the whole improvement planning process, performance appraisal.
Joanne, are these, all of these sections, are they expected to tie in together? I mean, are all principles expected to be measured on each one of these, or are they adapted?
They are adapted. Every principle, the reason they're called the core leadership capacities is these are the ones that everybody must demonstrate competency or some expertise in these areas. These are the fundamentals in Canada, in Ontario. They have been described as the fundamentals of effective leadership. And we get lots of support throughout the province for designing, developing, and delivering on these capacities. So.
Great. And another question, how are you gathering data to determine the level of growth achieved by leaders around these capacities?
That's it's a district responsibility. That's a good question. It's a district responsibility, and each district must have a leadership development strategy in place to which they report to the Ministry of Education, and the data is collected at that level. And the data is usually founded upon the performance appraisal process, and it's also founded upon the student achievement results, both in the standardized testing process that we have here. We have both school improvement planning requirements and school effectiveness framework that's based on, and we also have the district effectiveness framework that it defines the progress, the data, but it's a district responsibility. This is kind of what I was just explaining. I think it's an interesting and effective phenomenon for education in Ontario, which we describe, as most places in North America are. In fact, I would say all. It's a standards-based system. So we have lots of what I would call exemplars or frameworks that are easily accessed. So there's never any lack of clarity, I guess would be how you would describe it, about what it is toward which we are working. So we have this leadership framework, the school effectiveness framework, the effective district framework, and of course all of our student expectations, both content and performance expectations for every subject, for every grade, every discipline. It's all very clear, and again, it's built on clarity of where it is we're going toward. And that's a relatively new phenomena in Ontario. I would say it's probably a phenomenon that's only about 9 years old, but it has built a very strong focus for all improvement, whether it's school or principal performance or teacher performance. It has built a very strong foundation that everybody's working towards.
Joanne, is calibration across districts a concern? How they are scoring principal competencies? You know, how do you know superior in one district is the same as superior in another in terms of scoring principal competencies?
We don't have superior, good, all those kinds of ranges. We have satisfactory or unsatisfactory. When I go through the process of the PPA, maybe that will become clearer. Here we go, the process. First of all, it's a legal requirement, and all appointed school leaders, principals and vice principals, are required to have a principal performance appraisal process. The cycle is every 5 years, but when you're newly appointed, it happens in the second year. And it's essential for a board to put all of this into place, that leadership development strategy, and it is monitored from the Provincial Ministry of Education. And it's designed to ensure that school leaders feel the support and they recognize that it's a growth process. It is not a test. It is not a checklist. It is meant to identify strengths and identify growth. And as I mentioned before, it streamlines board practices and focuses efforts to achieve the goals, by giving both formal and informal opportunities for feedback, dialogue, and ongoing professional learning. And that is genuinely the process that's used. The supervisory officers, who are the people that are responsible for a consortium of schools or a cohort of schools and their leaders, are very much perceived and genuinely are partners in the learning process. And often their most recognized support is in helping principals work together and share learning opportunities and share expertise as well. We have a very sophisticated mentoring coaching program here as well. Continuing on with the process, the performance appraisal process develops goals to improve student achievement and well-being, and it also aligns with the board's improvement plan and the school improvement plan and the school and community context and so on. So it's not a sort of a goal, the principal's goal, that is plopped into a context that is irrelevant. It is all part of the streamlining and focusing of board, school, community, ministry, personal goals. So it's very much meant to be part of the collaborative process. The process, as I mentioned, is to address unsatisfactory performance, and I can go through that in a little bit of detail. If an unsatisfactory rating occurs, and that can happen if a principal or a vice principal is, I would use the word distracted. And we all get distractions in our schools and in our communities and from our teachers and so on. But the goal is to have goals, be very specific of what those goals are, and to measure those goals consistently according to the plan. Unsatisfactory occurs if there has been no progress towards that. So we have a process in place that's fairly simple but effective in that, without getting into gradations of performance like level 5, level 4, and so on, because when we were first implementing this process, when we were first implementing the performance appraisal process, there were lots of stakeholders who thought that we needed things like excellent or very good or satisfactory and so on. But when it all came down to the final decisions, it was agreed that just a simple satisfactory or unsatisfactory would fit the bill. And the satisfactory and unsatisfactory is based on the goals that have been set and the achievement of the goals. If there is an unsatisfactory process, or if an unsatisfactory is the result of the 5th year, remember we have annual growth plans that are done throughout the 5-year cycle, which culminate into a performance plan, which is the 5th year and the final summative evaluation. So an unsatisfactory is not something that should be a surprise to the principal. It should be an ongoing dialogue that results in unsatisfactory. And if that happens, a process kicks in where the appraiser, if it's a vice principal, that's usually the principal. If it's a principal, it's the supervisory officer, kicks in where the reasons for the unsatisfactory have occurred. And again, as I said, it shouldn't be a surprise. Being very specific about what is lacking in the performance, what is expected of the appraisee in areas, and so, in other words, what are you going to do about this, and certainly a whole improvement planning process with timelines has to kick in. When that happens, and the timeline is prescribed, I believe it's 15 days process, and then the improvement plan comes after that, and then there is steps and actions that the appraisee has to take to improve. And at the end of the timeline of that improvement planning process, there has to occur another appraisal. And the appraisal, again, is based on the specific goals that have been written in the improvement planning process. Again, second unsatisfactory process, the process kicks in where the principal or the vice principal goes on what's called review. And that's a whole process that takes time, but can, and I won't say often does, but occasionally it leads to dismissal. That it's not part of our dilemma here in Ontario is that principals are not part of the union and don't, but they do get support from OPC, which is a professional association, and how to deal with that process, whether it means dismissal or whether it means going back to teaching or that kind of thing. But you can see on the chart that just came up, the third unsatisfactory rating, it really is a district responsibility to see what happens next. And that in OPC is always involved at that stage, whether it's negotiating a better process for the person or counseling them out of leadership or whatever. There's a chart that shows the overview of the whole process.
And that first initial meeting between the appraiser and appraisee, is that professional growth or performance plan, is it developed individually with regard to factoring in local context that the principal, you know, like their level of experience, the local school conditions, and all sorts of contexts that they might be facing? I mean, how does that work?
First of all, it's always based on the leadership framework, which is the common language that everybody is aware of and feels comfortable using. And then, as you're describing, there's lots of local contextual nuances. So a simple thing like setting direction or building a common vision, for example, might in a school that is a rural school with many First Nations students, that's going to involve working with the tribes of the First Nations communities. So the contextual pieces are definitely there. The framework is the common language. The specifics are determined by the context. Another good question that you asked there is, what about levels of experience or years of experience? If a principal's been in a school for the last 4 years and is doing their performance appraisal on the 5th year, there's going to be a higher level of expectation of influence on student achievement and community building and trust in the teaching staff and so on than I just arrived yesterday or maybe I'm just arriving next Tuesday. So those kinds of things do actually factor in, and they should.
Wonderful. There's another question regarding professional development. I mean, does this system have professional development and resources for the principal built into it?
Yes, yes. A lot of another contextual piece of Canada or Ontario, I should say, not Canada, compared to many other places in the world is we have a required principal's qualification program. If you're a teacher and you think you want to be a principal, then you have to take over 300 hours of specific training related to that role. And all of our certification programs, all of our professional development programs, experienced principals programs from OPC and from school districts and from the ministry are based on the leadership framework. The ministry in the last 8 years has been what I would describe as generous in understanding that professional learning has to be integral to the ongoing professional growth of all school leaders. I would also say that fortunately the Ontario Principals Council where I work has been recognized as one of the agencies through which very focused, relevant professional learning can happen, and boards provide professional development funds through which school leaders can access professional learning through their professional association, OPC. So it has been very generous in the last 8 years, Having said that, we're going through, I think, where everybody else in the world is going through right now, some cutbacks and financial restraints. So, you know, I'm not guaranteeing that that will continue, but there's certainly a clear recognition that school leadership is money well spent. Okay, and this question came up earlier, but and I think I've already made reference to this, but we have, fortunately, many of the world's recognized school leadership gurus right here in our midst here in Toronto in Canada. And Dr. Ken Leithwood, who does a lot of work with the Wallace Foundation and with Karen Seashore Lewis and others, works very closely with us and with our Ministry of Education. In fact, he's the senior advisor to the Leadership Development Branch at our Ministry of Education. And one of the things that he says is that school leadership is second only to teaching in having an impact on student achievement. And in his most recent presentations, he will say quite overtly that for a broader impact on students generally and on student achievement on a school basis and on a district basis, that it is the school leadership where determining factors are going to be founded. So that in itself, and with him also writing some of the foundation of the leadership framework, we are very fortunate to have him as an advocate for school principals and vice principals and leadership generally throughout the province. And also we have, of course, Michael Fullen. I think everybody in education knows Michael Fullen, and we co-published many of his books. But our whole principal performance appraisal process is based on that research, knowing the important role that school leaders play, not just in improving the system, but being very directly influencing school and student achievement. And the other part here, the progress and success of all students in Ontario is contingent on effective leadership throughout the system. And as I mentioned before, we often talk about best leaders are the ones who build that capacity and have the focus on teaching and learning, and certainly our results in the international standardized testing, PISA, et cetera, TIMS, is reflective of that focus, and our pan-Canadian results, Ontario is at the top of the results there, and certainly internally our own Education Quality and Accountability Office is proving that we're doing a few things right. Anyway, the next slide has some websites where much of what I've talked about is easily accessed, and there's nothing here that's copyrighted or private. These are all things that come right off of our Ministry of Education websites.
Joanne, I do have a question for you. With regard to, as you know, a lot of states right now are working on developing or redesigning their principal evaluation systems with race to the top money and stuff like that. Since you're such an expert in this area, at least with Canada, can you give any tips or advice for our principals down here for like what steps you see us moving toward or what they can do?
Well, I'm probably not as familiar as I should be towards some of the direction that states are going here. But I can tell you from our experience, there's 2 or 3 things that I would recommend at least trying to focus on. One is this whole notion of performance appraisal being a growth model. So selecting what it is that is important for you in your school that's aligned with the bigger picture related to the state direction, and make it very precise what the goals are. That way the appraisal process makes measurement of the goals much more tolerable or much more measurable, or so that in the negotiations around what is effective leaders practice, what does it look like, then there is very specific behaviors or very specific strategies that can be identified as growth and improved performance. That would be one. The other thing I think that caution might be is letting whatever the appraisal process looks like devolve, I would call it, into a checklist. Yep, I do this, yep, 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 oh, maybe I better work on that. Or having somebody else externally say, yes, yeah, you know, the checklist idea, oh yeah, all these are working, but because lots of times those external people don't live your life in your school, and popping in for a performance appraisal checklist is not going to give opportunity to demonstrate some of the extraordinary things that school principals are doing across North America. So those are a couple of things that I would say we had to, in our development process here, those are things that we had to ward against, and so maybe those might be things that you need to think about.
I don't know if many of you know, but NAESP has been working for about 2 years now on this question of principal evaluation, and last year we partnered with the National Association of Secondary School Principals, NAESP, to come together to form a task force or a principal evaluation committee to really look at this issue of principal evaluation. And it's funny, Joanne, these two recommendations that you have, and among the recommendations are looking at a framework of 6 evaluation categories, the number one being professional growth and development, and then also looking at local context. So thank you very much for those tips. I would like to thank Joanne for this. We have some information on contact details. Joanne, do you have any closing remarks about anything that you'd like to talk about for this session?
A personal comment to all of you, and I'm assuming most of you are practicing principals and vice principals, and if you're anything like my colleagues here in Ontario, if you're feeling some of the pressures of student achievement and the weight of making sure that your schools are happy, safe, caring, learning environments and so on, but I don't know what the word might be, but to encourage you to recognize, even in a world where it seems like nobody else does, but they are. We've done lots of research talking to try and get a read of our public opinion and our government opinion about the role of principal, and to reassure you that there is no other collection of people in the education system generally who are more trusted and well respected than the principals. In all of our surveys that we have done, both in Canada and around the world, the result always comes back to who is the most trusted person in education, and every year for 11 years now the answer has been, the person I trust most is my child's teacher, which we think that's very interesting because everybody in the community thinks, oh, those teachers are not doing their work, they're really unfocused, but it's interesting because my child's teacher is the best. But who do they take second above all else? It's the principal, and they like their principals, they trust their principals, and they perceive their principals as advocates for their child's education. So when the whole weight of the world does seem to be sitting on your shoulders, remind yourself that you have a critical role to play in influencing hundreds of children's lives.
So true, Joanne, and we, of course, at the national associations would definitely agree with you. In our research, we know that principals are indeed the catalyst for change, and so much of the good work that goes on in schools is because of their hard work. So thank you again very much for these comments. I hope you all got something out of it today. Again, thank you, Joanne, for sharing your experience, and I hope some of you will contact Joanne for more information on this topic. Thank you
Thank you very much.